They had been told that capture meant the end, that if American soldiers found them, they would be mistreated, violated, and terminated. But when Japanese women were taken prisoner in the final days of World War II, what happened next left them completely stunned. Watch until the end of the video to find out why. In the final chaotic months of the Second World War, the Japanese Empire was collapsing. Across the Pacific, on islands like Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, the once fierce Japanese military was reduced to scattered pockets of soldiers and civilians, many of them women. They were nurses, clerks, and volunteers from the Women's Auxiliary, some barely out of their teens. For years they had lived under strict imperial orders. Afterlife before dishonor. In every speech, in every school book, they had been taught that surrender to the Americans meant shame and regret. The propaganda machine painted the enemy as monsters, barbarians who would violate, mistreat, and terminate any woman who fell into their hands. It was a powerful message drilled into every heart. If capture was inevitable, afterlife was preferable, and many believed it completely. So when the U.S. forces advanced across the islands, when the thunder of artillery came closer each day, many of these women prepared for the worst. Some hid in caves, clutching grenades or blades, waiting for the moment the enemy would arrive. Others wept quietly, convinced their fate had already been sealed. They had heard the stories, the exaggerations, the rumors that had grown through years of war. To them, the American soldier was a faceless beast, incapable of mercy. Then came the day of capture. When American patrols reached the caves and dugouts where the women were hiding, the reaction was pure anxiety. Many of the women screamed or tried to flee. Some bowed so low their foreheads touched the ground, begging to be terminated rather than captured. Others froze completely, unable to speak or move, waiting for the horrors they had been promised. But what happened next defied everything they had been told. The American soldiers lowered their weapons. Instead of shouting or striking, they called for interpreters. They spoke calmly, motioning with open hands. They offered water. Some extended ration packs, cans of food, pieces of chocolate, even cigarettes. When one woman collapsed from exhaustion, a medic rushed forward to help her. There was no anger in their faces, no cruelty, no mockery. And most shocking of all, they didn't touch them. The American troops kept a respectful distance, speaking gently through translators, ensuring the women were safe and treated properly. They gave them blankets, guided them to medical tents, and made sure they were fed. The women were too stunned to believe it. Some waited, trembling, expecting the kindness to turn into something terrible. But it never did. For many of these women, this moment shattered years of fear and indoctrination. Everything they had been told about the Americans was being disproven in front of their eyes. When the captured women were later moved to prisoner of war camps, the same discipline continued. The camps were run under the Geneva Convention, and the rules were clear. Prisoners, regardless of gender, were to be treated humanely. In the United States and Allied bases in the Pacific, military police enforced these rules with precision. Guards were instructed to show restraint and professionalism. To the Japanese women, who had grown up in a culture that expected brutality from conquerors, it was incomprehensible. They were given medical examinations, new clothes, soap, and food. Some were even allowed to write letters home, though few had families left to contact. They were housed separately from male prisoners and monitored by female nurses or Red Cross workers. At mealtime, American officers ensured that the women received the same rations as male POWs. It was a world away from the horror stories they had been told. In their own army, the treatment of captives had been harsh. The Japanese military code viewed surrender as weakness, so enemy prisoners were often treated with contempt or worse. These women had seen that firsthand, and now, to find themselves on the opposite side of that equation, being treated with dignity by the very men they had been raised to hate, was deeply confusing. Some of the women began to talk quietly among themselves in the camps. They spoke about their families, about what they had believed, about how different the Americans seemed from the monsters in their government's propaganda. One woman later wrote that the first time she saw an American soldier look away politely as she washed clothes near a stream, she began to cry. It was a simple act of decency, but one that felt like a revelation. Days turned into weeks, and the fear began to fade. The soldiers guarding them became familiar faces. A few learned small English words. "Thank you, water, please." Some of the younger American guards, barely older than the women themselves, smiled awkwardly when they passed. There was no hostility, no cruelty, just order and discipline. For many of the prisoners, that quiet respect broke them emotionally. They had spent years believing that the Americans were devils. Yet these same men showed compassion even after all that had happened, the bombings, the loss, the hatred. It was something the women couldn't explain, and for some, it sparked a lifelong reflection on everything they had been taught. When the war finally ended and the women were repatriated back to Japan, they returned to a country in ruins. Many had no homes to go back to, but they carried with them memories that would stay for the rest of their lives. The memory of how their enemies had treated them not as spoils of war, but as people. Some spoke about it decades later, quietly, in interviews or memoirs. They described the confusion they felt when American soldiers gave them food instead of punishment, or when guards saluted before speaking to them. They said that small gestures of respect did more to change their view of the world than any speech or policy ever could. Their stories became symbols of how human decency can survive even in times of unimaginable destruction. These women had been raised to believe that mercy was weakness, that surrender was disgrace, that the enemy was beyond redemption. But the men who captured them proved the opposite, that strength can come from restraint, and that honor can exist even in the heart of war. When they were told to line up for processing, no one laid a hand on them. When they were given food, no one demanded anything in return. When they were asked questions, they were treated with courtesy. To people who had lived through years of total war where cruelty was expected and mercy rare, it was the most shocking thing imaginable. And so, for those Japanese women prisoners, the most unforgettable moment was not the end of the war, not their release, not even their return home. It was the realization that the men they had feared the most, the men they had been taught to hate, had shown them compassion instead of mistreatment. It was a lesson that transcended nationality and politics. It was proof that even after years of hatred, the human heart is still capable of kindness. They came to believe that true victory does not belong to the side that destroys more, but to the side that chooses not to. And that choice, to show respect, to treat the enemy with dignity, became one of the quietest yet most powerful acts of the entire war. Subscribe for more true World War II stories.